Brüksel'e, Türkiye'ye çekebilir miyim diye. Ve çok şükür diyorum, başardık. Hem Turkcell'deki takımımıza kendisi destek oluyor, hem de Türkiye'nin iş dünyasının bizim takımın parçası olarak bize katıldı. Ve burada Türkiye Yatırım Ajansı ve Başkanı Alparslan Korkmaz'a da çok teşekkür ediyorum. Çünkü kendisinin yardımlarıyla Porter'ı gerçekten Türkiye'nin dört bir yanından inceleme fırsatını yarattık. Alparslan Bey çok teşekkürler. Fazla uzatmayacağım. Günün konuşmacısı Profesör Porter'ı sahneye davet ediyorum. Good luck. Nice to have you in Turkey.
Well, Saraya, thank you very much, and it's just a thrill for me to be here. I've been to Turkey before, but this time is different. This time is different because I've had a chance to get to know the country a little bit. I've gotten to know some of you a little bit. I've had my team working hard, trying to understand this economy and where the economy is and where you're going and where you need to go. And so this visit feels very, very different to me for a lot of reasons. And let me start by saying that if I could buy Turkey stock, I would buy it. I think this is an amazing country. I think you have an amazing opportunity in front of you. I think you have the capacity to not only create a great society for yourself, but I also think you have a great opportunity to actually inspire and help many other countries, both in this region and around the world. That's where I think I want to start this morning, with the incredible opportunity that is present here. Having said that, I think if you're going to achieve that potential, both in the companies that are represented here and in the country as a whole, I think the country is going to have to raise its game. You're going to have to change many, many things about how you do business in Turkey, and that's going to involve corporate changes, and that's going to involve government changes and policy changes and changes in the way government and business actually work together. So what I'd like to do this morning in my session, I've got actually quite a bit of time today, and I'm going to divide it in the following way. In this first session, I'd like to speak to business very specifically, and I'd like to talk about strategy. In the second session, after a break, I'd like to talk about the country, and I'd like to talk about the direction in which I think Turkey is going to need to move. And one of the major points I'd like to make is I think you in the business community are going to have to drive that change. You can't wait for or expect government to do it alone. So what I'd like to do is see if I can get all of you to think a little bit differently about your business, a little bit differently about your company, but also differently about your role and your responsibilities as leaders. I couldn't be prouder to be part of this leadership conference. I couldn't be prouder to have Saraya, my student. I want to congratulate and thank him for bringing us together. We have to use this time, I think, to see if we can't raise our game. That's the hope, that this meeting will be an opportunity to set in motion many forces which will raise the game of Turkey and realize this incredible potential. Now, unfortunately, I see on this slide the second presentation and not the first presentation. I should have noticed that the first minute I grows up. So let's let the no, he's not understanding. I need a technical expert here that knows how to work this computer. No, that's the wrong presentation. So we'll get to that presentation later. But where I want to start really is with the company sector, and let me just introduce that while we're looking for the actual slides. You know, Turkey has an interesting corporate history and an interesting national history. It's been a country that's been through a lot of ups and downs, a lot of crises, a lot of instability. Fortunately, of course, starting in 2001 in particular, you've had a tremendous surge of progress. But I think that the history has actually had a big impact on Turkish companies and on thinking in Turkey about strategy. As I've gotten to know many of the companies here, as we've done work with the Global Competitiveness Report, which I'm the chairman of, really surveying companies around the world and looking at Turkish companies, I think a number of kind of important transitions are necessary in strategy. I think traditionally, we've seen Turkish companies have tended to be very flexible and very opportunistic, able to kind of recognize and seize opportunities that emerge from a really somewhat complicated and maybe somewhat stressful environment. Now, I think instead of being reactive and opportunistic, the new agenda actually is to be strategic. There's not enough Turkish companies that are really strategic. You're good at operations, you're good at running the company. Many of you have quite sophisticated business processes. You have a lot of talented people, but what's missing in many Turkish companies is really a clear sense of strategic positioning. How are we going to build a unique position? How are we going to build the brand and the support services and all those aspects that are going to give us really something distinctive in the market? Tended to focus in Turkey on taking advantage of efficiency and a pretty good cost position. You know, how do we shift the thinking to value, to delivering value, to delivering ideally unique value in the marketplace, in this increasingly crowded world that we all compete in, and it's only going to get more crowded over the next 10 or 20 years. Most Turkish companies, if you look at the data, are still much too domestic, much too focused on this large, growing market of yours. The future is to be international, starting with the region, and we'll talk a lot about that this morning. The region is a tremendous opportunity for every single one of you, which you are uniquely positioned to serve. And yet only a few Turkish companies have really seized that opportunity yet. And finally, I think we've got a lot of groups here in Turkey that are still very diversified, that are still competing in lots of businesses that are very different. It's time to put that behind you and move to more focus in your business groups, where you can put together businesses that can leverage each other, which can enhance your competitive advantage, which can make your position more unique. There's a number of sort of management and leadership and strategic transitions that need to happen in this country if you're going to ultimately achieve the potential that you can achieve. We have a lot of good managers here. Turkish managers do well. They're well trained. They're well educated. They do well running multinationals. But what has to change is not the quality of the people, but the mindset, the mentality, the approach to thinking about how to build the business, to thinking about how to build the company's position in the long run. So how do we infuse more strategic thinking into Turkish companies? That's what I'd like to talk about this morning. And of course, strategic thinking is different for every business. Every business is different. We've got hundreds of different businesses represented in this room. But there's some underlying principles of strategic thinking that are universal. And it's those principles that I'd like to talk about this morning, and I'd like to ask you to think about your own business in light of these principles. And I'd like to suggest that part of what happens this morning is that a discussion begins between you and your team about where your company needs to go. if you're going to actually be truly world-class, if you're going to achieve the aspirations that you have, if you're going to achieve the opportunity and the potential that this country has. Now, how do we think strategically? Well, to think strategically, we've got to start out kind of understanding the right framing of the problem. And what I find is that when we start having strategy discussions, many managers that I work with kind of start out by thinking the job is, how can I be the best company? How can I be the best company in my industry? How can I be the best bank? How can I be the best cell phone provider? How can I be the best company in my industry? Because we all sort of start out with the idea we want to be the best at whatever we do. But what I found is that's a very dangerous way of thinking about building a really world-class company. The reason is that there is no best company. There is no best bank. It all depends on who you're trying to serve. It all depends on what customer needs you're trying to meet. Customers are different. We have a huge world here. We have billions of customers. They have very, very different needs. It's impossible to meet the needs of every customer. It's impossible. There's no best company. Instead, the fundamental starting point for all strategic thinking is the need to be unique. The need to deliver some kind of unique value. That your organization is best organized and designed to deliver. If we try to be the best, there's really only one best. If we try to be the best, we get into a destructive competition. If we try to be unique, we get into a competition that actually can expand the market. Because more needs are served and more customers are better served. The worst mistake in strategy is to get into a competition where you and your competitor are competing on the same thing. If your competitors set out to provide tremendous after-sales service, the worst mistake you can make is to chase them and set out to provide that as your unique advantage. Then you'll get into a destructive competition. It's very hard to win. The essence of strategy is figuring out how your particular organization is going to deliver something unique. Now, you've got to also learn all the best practices, and you've got to use those, but you've got to design and tailor and modify those best practices for your particular distinctive value, for your particular competitive advantage. Now, in order to think strategically, we've got to get way beyond a lot of sort of simplistic ideas of strategy that are still quite common, I find, when I work with companies. We've got to understand fundamentally what strategy really means. You'd think we'd know by now. It's a word we talk about a lot, but you'd be surprised how many bad strategy decisions come from really a misunderstanding of what strategy is. These are the three most common mistakes that I see. Some companies confuse having a strategy with taking a particular action. My strategy is to internationalize, they would say, for example. But that's not a strategy. That's an action step. That may be a good step. But the strategy is the unique position that you're going to achieve by internationalizing, or the advantage that's going to be able to be leveraged by internationalizing. We can't confuse the strategy with any single action step, however important it is. We can't confuse the strategy with the goal. Many companies do this. They say, my strategy is to be number one in the market. That's not a strategy. That's a hope. That's a goal. The strategy is the advantages that you will build to allow you to be number one or number two or number three, whatever's feasible. We have to separate the strategy from the goal. And we have to go beyond vision. I'm very tired now of vision statements and mission statements. I'm tired of reading them. They're very broad statements of our general principles, and they're very inspirational, but they're not a strategy. A strategy is very specific. It's very concrete. It's about what particular value you're going to deliver to your customer. Being a good company for mankind is not enough. You've got to go that next step. Strategy is that next step, that step that's fundamentally focused on competitive advantage. So when we think about strategy, we've got to think about it in terms of its essence, its essential purpose, its essential characteristics. Now, in order to have any hope of a good strategy, we have to express our financial goals properly. And again, I find a lot of mistakes here. If we're going to develop a really good strategy, we have to understand that the fundamental goal, the number one goal, has to be earning a good return on capital. Not in a single year, because that changes for lots of reasons, and we may need to be investing. But over a sustained period of time, 3, 5, 7-year period. Return on capital is the fundamental goal of any company. If you earn a good return on capital, you know that you're creating value. You can sell your product for more than the full cost of producing it. So that has to be the principal goal of any company. Growth is good. It's a good goal. But growth is number 2. If you have to earn a good return on capital and then grow as fast as possible, but you can't forget the return to grow, at least not for more than 3 or 4 or 5 years. And market share is a terrible goal. It's meaningless. Market share doesn't get you anything, per se. The goal is profitability. If market share ultimately is important in driving profitability and good return on capital, good, fine, do it. But putting market share and being big as a goal is a silly thing to aspire to. We've learned that over and over and over again. There's no honor in being big. There's no honor in being big. There's honor in being profitable. There's honor in making a good return and then hopefully growing your business as rapidly as you can. This all sounds very simple. You'd be surprised how many great companies have messed up because they haven't understood the simple truth about how to measure success. Let's assume we've got the right goal. How do we kind of relate that to the stock market? Here's another problem we're having right now. Too many companies think that the stock price is the goal. Stock price isn't the goal. The stock price is the result of the real goal, which is superior performance. We know that a company's stock over a 3 or 4 year period will respond to its real performance. But we also know that because of the volatility of the financial markets, in any given year, the chances are very high that your price of your stock is too high or it's too low. It's almost never exactly right. Companies that try to focus on the stock price get into big trouble, because the stock market is ultimately a much shorter term game than actually building a great company and building a great strategy. One of the greatest threats to strategy today that I see over and over again is actually the stock market. So you've got to understand that your job as a leader is not to please today's shareholder. Your job as a leader is to build a great company that can achieve superior performance. I promise you, I swear to you, the stock price will take care of itself. You don't have to worry about that. It will follow your performance, maybe not immediately, but eventually. And your company will be much, much stronger in the process. Now, when we think about strategy, we've got to be very careful now to divide it into 2 broad parts. One part of strategy is what we call business strategy or competitive strategy. How do you compete in each single business in which you're operating? That is the fundamental level of strategy. That's where competitive advantage is usually won or lost, overwhelmingly. There's another level of strategy, which is the corporate strategy or the group strategy. And that has to do with how you combine businesses together into a diversified group. And that can be important, but that's very separate. It has to be separated. You've got to look at these two questions differently. They involve really different underlying principles. So let's spend most of our time today that we have, which is very short, on competitive strategy and the principles there, and then I'll talk very briefly about the corporate level. Now, in order to understand how to drive a business to achieve superior performance, we've got to, I think, first understand that performance is fundamentally driven by two broad areas. One has to do with the industry you're in. Part of your performance has to do with the performance of the industry. You are part of an industry that is going to shape your success. If the industry does well, you will do well. If the industry does poorly, you will do poorly. That's a big part of your performance. The more you're a leader, the more the industry is almost everything. If you're a leader, you're tied to the industry very, very tightly. And then the other part of your performance has to do with the position you occupy within the industry, your competitive position. And of course, the key question is, do you have an advantage? If you have an advantage, you can do better than the industry. If you don't have an advantage, you'll probably do worse than the industry. Now, what we find is that many companies kind of get these two things all tangled up and confused. Here's a simple example of two companies, two different industries. Revlon, you know, cosmetics, PACCAR, heavy trucks. Interestingly enough, Revlon is actually a poor performer in a good industry. PACCAR is an excellent performer in a very challenging industry. They're in fundamentally different situations. Their strategic issues are completely different. For Revlon, it's a positioning problem. For PACCAR, it's how to deal with this difficult industry. See? You have to understand what kind of problem you have. Hopefully you don't have both. Hopefully you don't have both. A lousy position in a lousy industry, you probably should, you know, cash out and go out and see the beautiful country of Turkey. You've got to understand which kind of problem you have. Do you have a good position in a difficult industry, a good position in a good industry? Just what's your fundamental strategic challenge? Now, we've learned over the years, and this was some of the earliest work I did, we've learned how important the structure of an industry is for determining industry performance. There's a tremendous difference across industries in every country in terms of their sustained profitability, having to do with industry structure. I'm sure all of you are familiar with the concepts of industry structure. That we have to think fundamentally about the industry in terms of barriers to entry and the power of the customer and those kind of factors. Every company has to understand the structure of its industry and how it's changing and how new technologies are going to evolve the industry over time and what that might mean for your particular business. That's a fundamental part of strategic thinking. What I think many managers don't appropriately understand is that the great challenge of industry is to actually create a positive competition, not a zero-sum competition. You know, so many industries get into a competition where companies are competing head-to-head, and where that happens, for you to win, somebody else has to lose. And that's a very dangerous kind of competition because it almost always erodes the whole value pool in the industry. Instead, in an ideal world, you would find a way to kind of reshape competition in your industry so that it was more of a positive-sum competition. A competition on strategy, not a competition on head-to-head. And that often has the opposite effect. Now let's talk about a little example of just how this kind of thinking gets actualized in terms of a strategy. Here's a heavy truck case, a case that I have come to know very well. Remember I said earlier, heavy trucks are a very unattractive industry. The average return on capital pre-tax is only about 10%, and it's been that way for about 20 years. Very difficult industry. Why is it a difficult industry? The customer has a lot of power. Big fleets, buying lots of trucks, bargaining down the price. The barriers to entry are not so high. Many of the companies are simply assemblers. It's easy to get in. Doesn't take much capital, doesn't take much real know-how. Many of the suppliers, certainly in North America, have a lot of power too. So the truck manufacturer is squeezed between powerful suppliers and powerful customers. Not a good recipe for profitability. And what happens is you have a lot of very destructive price competition in the industry. Although the costs are fixed, there's a lot of competition on price. Price goes down, return on capital goes down. The overall average return in the industry is relatively low. That's a story that may be similar to your industry, it may not. But the question is, how do we think about strategic positioning in the context of the kind of industry structure in which we find ourselves? And the answer is, we have to think creatively, but we have to be informed by the underlying economics and this kind of analytical thinking. What PACCAR has done is they've said, no, we don't want to serve the big customers. We don't want to serve the big customers. The big customers are lousy customers. All they do is beat us up. So what this company did is it found a portion of the industry, not all of it, a portion of the industry that are called owner-operators. These are people that buy one truck, they buy two trucks, they often drive their own truck, they're not a driver for a big company. What they discovered was that this buyer, this particular customer, really was incredibly emotionally tied to their truck because they lived in it 200, 300 days a year. And it was kind of like their tool. It was like their tool of their trade. And they didn't want a truck that looked exactly like everybody else's truck. And since they were living in the truck most nights of the year, they wanted a nice place to live. They didn't want to live in a place that looked like every other place that every other trucker had in the back of their truck. Big heavy trucks have a compartment in the back behind the driver's compartment where actually there's a bed and a microwave and a TV and various kinds of amenities. And this customer, this was their house. And they were very interested in the design and the quality of that house. So what PACCAR was able to do is build a whole strategy around this customer and this customer's needs, and you see some of the key elements there. Remember the earlier slide. This company was earning 30% return in a 10% industry because they pulled themselves away from the destructive competition and they pulled themselves into a positive-sum competition where they were creating tremendous value for a customer that appreciated that value and was actually willing to pay a premium for the truck as long as the truck lasted a long time and was inexpensive to operate and actually had a high resale price. So they created a whole different value proposition, and they were able to be successful despite a difficult industry. That's strategic thinking. That's the kind of thinking that every single company here needs to be doing about their business. How are you going to carve out a distinctive position? And it may not be on higher price. It could be because you're more efficient, because you're serving a certain part of the market that doesn't need a lot of services. So you can be even more efficient in serving those customers than the average customer. There's many different kinds of strategies. There's no one strategy. It's the principles. It's the principles that we have to focus on. Now let's turn to the issue of positioning. Every one of you, as you approach your industry, I hope you want to be superior. I hope you want to be one of the leaders in your industry. To be one of the leaders, you've got to achieve either a higher price or a lower cost position. To be superior in terms of profitability, you've got to do one of those two things. You've got to drive up the price, you've got to drive down the cost compared to your competitor. Your Turkish competitor, your international competitor. Every one of you, I hope, could tell me what you're trying to do. Very clearly. You could say, look, my positioning, I'm trying to drive up that price by providing these extra services and so forth. Or I am going to be really, really efficient because I've done this, I've done that, and I've done that. Positioning starts with an understanding of how your choices are going to allow you to be more profitable, ultimately through price or cost. So everybody has to kind of understand that, because if you don't understand it, your organization won't understand it, you'll never be able to do it. You, as Soraya said earlier, you've got to set the direction. You've got to help people understand, what are we trying to achieve? Where are we trying to go in our business? Now, in order to achieve a low cost or a higher price, we've got to really understand the value chain. How are we delivering value? How are we performing the various activities in the business? How are we manufacturing? How are we selling? How are we distributing? How are we developing? How are we supplying and procurement? And there's a whole set of activities involved in any business. Every business is a little bit different. And so the question is, how have you designed your value chain in order to either be high price or low cost? Or in very rare situations, both. That is kind of the fundamental thinking process that underlies a really successful strategy. And what we know is that if you're going to have a successful strategy, it's almost never the case that you'll succeed because of just one thing. There's not usually just one thing here that gives successful companies their advantage. In fact, as we'll see later, what gives successful companies their advantage is often many things, except that they're not unrelated things, they're interconnected things. So we'll come back to that a little bit later. But in terms of analyzing competitive advantage, you've got to be able to look very carefully within your value chain. You just can't be satisfied with a list of strengths. You've got to really dig into, how have I designed my model or my value chain in order to deliver that advantage in the marketplace. Now this leads to another really fundamentally important strategic principle, and that is that you've got to run the business very well. You've got to be operationally effective. You've got to assimilate best practices. All the best practices you can find. You've got to learn everything you possibly can about how to do every part of the value chain at world class. Whether it be the supply chain or the procurement or the HR management or the internet marketing, you've got to learn all the best practices. And that's kind of the baseline. Strategy doesn't matter unless you're operationally efficient, unless you have mastered best practices. But we also find that just being operationally efficient is not usually going to lead to a competitive advantage. Why? Because everybody else can do it too, and will. So, in addition to being operationally efficient, you've got to have a clear idea of your positioning. How you are going to deliver something distinctive. And in order to do that, we found that there are, at the very deep principle level, at the fundamental level, there are 5 tests, 5 conditions that an excellent strategy has to meet. If it's going to be sustainable, if it's going to lead to a real advantage that matters, that has impact in the marketplace. Number 1, if you're going to actually have a strategy, you've got to have defined a different way of creating value than your competitors have defined. A different way of creating value. What's a value proposition? For strategy purposes, It's 3 questions. What set of customers are you going to serve? You might serve many customers. But what we've learned is it's hard to meet all the needs of every customer. That's almost always a bad idea. Which needs are you going to meet? You may try to meet just one need of many different kinds of customers, or you may try to meet a deep set of needs of a relatively constrained group of customers. There are lots of choices. Every industry is different. Every company has different assets and skills and values and principles. But you've got to have a clarity, an understanding of what actually you're trying to do. And then, what price will you ask? Will you command a premium? Will you offer a discount? Will you seek parity? These 3 areas constitute the value proposition. And the key idea for strategy is you have to have a different answer than your competitors. Because if you're trying to meet the same needs of the same customers at the same relative price, then that's no strategy. That's just competing on best practice. Who can do the same thing better? And it's hard to win that game. It's very hard to win that game. You can be lucky. You can have a competitor who's lazy or stupid. But usually, sooner or later, that competitor is not going to be lazy and stupid. So in order to win, you can't count on that. You've got to count on making some clear choices about how you're going to separate yourself from that competitor in the marketplace. That's really the first condition. And by the way, the value proposition has to be different enough that it's easy to explain. If it takes you like 20 minutes to explain why you're a little bit different, not going to work. It's got to be one paragraph. Here's how we're different. It's got to be so clear that your customer can understand it, your employees can understand it, your suppliers can understand it, and ideally the stock market can understand it. And it has to be really simple for the stock market to understand it. Okay? Because the analysts often are barely shaving. You know, they're so young. They don't know much about business in many cases. They know a lot about mathematics. Okay? There are a lot of my students are analysts, so I'm saying this with affection, you know, not with scorn. Okay. Unique value proposition. But that's just a start. Then what you've got to do is design a different way of delivering that value so that you will be different. And that value proposition gets realized by choices that you make in the value chain. How to market, how to produce, how to sell, how to supply, how to service. You must make different choices about how you're actually operating the business. The value proposition just can't be a slogan. You know, it has to be actualized into the bricks and mortar and people, you know, of the business itself. This is a great example. I love a great strategy case of IKEA, the Swedish-based furniture retailer. And you can see how they've got a really clear idea of who they're trying to serve. I personally hate this company. I hate everything about them. Every time I go to one of their stores, which I have to because my daughter makes me go, I am terribly uncomfortable the entire time. I can't wait to leave. My daughter loves this store because they speak to her. She's a college student. She's kind of fairly well educated. She's got a good sense of taste, but she doesn't have a lot of money to spend on furniture. She lives in a relatively small apartment. They speak to her. And they create products and services that meet her needs. But they don't do it just by claiming they do it. They do it by running their business fundamentally differently than their competitors. Now, an interesting question then is IKEA the best furniture company? No, they're not. That's the wrong question. The right question is IKEA meeting an important set of needs for an important set of customers uniquely well? That's the right question. Their answer is yes. Nobody is able to imitate them, because they have a fundamental clarity of purpose and direction that they just keep getting better at over time. You know, one of the good tests of a strategy is, have you made some customers unhappy? If you haven't made some customers unhappy, and if you're not comfortable with that, then the chances are you don't have a strategy. Because the essence of strategy is actually choice. Making choices. And that leads to the next kind of key principle of strategy, and that's the idea of trade-offs. Trade-offs. A trade-off is where, to do one thing, you must give up the opportunity to do something else. That's a trade-off. And all great strategies involve trade-offs, where in order to be uniquely good at serving my daughter, IKEA makes choices that I hate, that would meet my needs, but they can't do both at the same time. See, I find that many managers, and by the way, particularly engineers, try to have it all. They try to put every possible feature into their product. They try to put every possible service into their basket of services, and they end up maybe doing okay, but they're not great. They're not unique. They're not world-class. You've got to be willing to make those trade-offs, and that's uncomfortable. Because some customer will come to you and say, well, I want this. And you have to say, I'm sorry, we don't do that. But most managers can't say that. What they say is, oh, of course. And then, of course, they screw up their whole operation trying to meet the need that they're not really well equipped to meet. So these are the core principles of strategy. This is how we have to learn to think if we're going to build truly great companies. There's no one formula for strategy. It's unique to every company. It must be, by definition, strategy must be unique to every company. Again, IKEA is a great example. And we make these slides available to any of you that are interested, so I'm sorry to go so quickly. Final principle, or nearly final principle, is you've got to take the various parts of your business and make them work together. You can't just see your marketing separate from your production, separate from your service, separate from your supply chain. You have to find a way of harnessing the power of interconnectedness across the various choices that you make about how to run the business. We call this FIT, F-I-T, FIT. And Zara, which is the great clothing company, is just a marvelous example of that. You all know the Zara story probably better than I do, but the essence of this story is that the pieces are incredibly interconnected and they reinforce each other. Now, when you have this kind of a strategy, what happens is that your competitor finds it almost impossible to copy you. Why? Because you can't just copy one thing. You can't just copy the product. You could copy the Zara product, but unless you had the rest of this stuff, it wouldn't work. Because you couldn't get the product in the store, you couldn't get it out of the store, you'd have the wrong marketing model, see? So the essence of strategy is to raise the bar so that to imitate you, your competitor has to basically change everything they do and do it like you do. They're not going to do that. And that's why, even though many people in my business of management thinking say, oh, every strategy is easy to copy, it's not easy to copy. This strategy has never been copied. IKEA, never been copied. Southwest Airlines, never been copied. Apple Computer, never been copied. There's lots of strategies that have never been copied and never will be copied because it's almost impossible to copy them. You're crazy to even try. It's a really bad idea to try to copy a successful strategy. Instead, find another one. Find a new emerging segment of the market that you can then develop a strategy around. Don't chase somebody else. That never works, because they're usually better at it than you are. And I think it goes without saying that the essence of strategy is continuity. You've got to stick with it, because it takes time to build a skill, to get the customer to understand it, and so on and so on and so on. And in Turkey, we haven't thought about running companies with a 5-year horizon. We've thought about running companies not knowing what's going to happen next. And that's a mindset change. It's stable here now. The platform is going to be strong. We now have to lengthen our horizon and think about continuity, and think about building assets, and not worry about the profit in 1 year as much as we have in the past. That is a critical part of strategic thinking. In order to grow a business, we've got to be very careful about growing it the right way. The thing that really hurts successful companies, I find the most, is not a competitor. It's not technology. I've done lots of work on this. What really hurts successful companies is they grow the wrong way. They erode their advantage because they expand into business segments that they don't have anything to offer that's different. And so on and so on and so on. You've got to grow the right way. And part of growing the right way is to grow geographically, because there's a gigantic market out there. You don't need to change your strategy to grow. Find new markets in which your strategy is valid. Bring that strategy to new markets. And this is a tremendous opportunity for every single one of you today in this region, where you are much better equipped to compete in the region than pretty much anybody else in the world. And if you just think about it that way, you can extend your strategies and deepen them and be very, very successful. Now, those of you that are in diversified groups, thinking strategically for a diversified group is to get away from the idea of a holding company. In an advanced economy, there's no room for a holding company. That's a developing country thing. Holding companies are a developing country thing. In an advanced economy with improving capital markets and more competition, you've got to focus. You've got to get leverage across your businesses. You can't just see each business as a separate entity. They've got to reinforce each other across the value chain. And what we tend to see in developing countries is we tend to see the business groups start by looking like this: a little bit of everything, opportunistic, which partner showed up determines what business you're in. And we tend to see a migration as you get into more advanced economies of much more integrated, synergistic business groups. And that's, for some of you, is going to be your big strategic agenda. Not tomorrow, not next week, but over the next 5 to 10 years. Because my prediction is the capital markets here are going to get more efficient. You're going to continue to be opening to international competition. There's a lot of great companies in this world that are going to think that Turkey is an attractive place to do business. You're not going to be able to support all these businesses that you have in the past. You're going to have to make some choices from a corporate point of view as well. Again, every business is different. Every business has different specific decisions it has to make, but we've got to change the model. It's time to change the model in more and more companies. Some of you are already there. Many of you have a ways to go. Many of you have to sort of move from price to value in your thinking. Many of you have to move from really market share to unique positioning. Many of you have to go from a product-centric view to really more of a customer experience view. Many of you have to stop thinking about just exporting the same products and start thinking about a regional and global strategy. Some of you are going to have to reshape your group. These are the kind of big strategic transformations that at least what my experience tells me are necessary for some of you. Not every one of you, but for some of you. This is the shift in thinking mentality that needs to take place. Now, why doesn't this happen? Why do so many good companies have bad strategies? Well, part of it has to do with the quality of their strategic thinking in terms of the principles. A lot of it has to do with the incredible pressure to imitate. There's incredible pressure to imitate. It comes from many sources. It's very hard to say, oh, Hewlett-Packard does it this way, but I'm going to do it this way. It's very hard to do that. And that's human nature. But again, if you imitate, it's almost impossible to be successful unless there's enough things that you do that are really different. I find that customer pressure often makes strategy difficult, because your customer asks you for things that you shouldn't provide, but you feel you have to. I find it's very hard for salespeople, to turn down an order and say, oh, no, we don't want that money. We won't take it. Very hard to do that. Psychologically difficult. It often feels like it's going to cover your overhead. There's all kinds of excuses for why to take the order that doesn't fit your strategy. Setting the wrong kind of goals. Focusing too much on the short term. Thinking too much about growth and not enough about profitability. Too much consensus thinking is not good for strategy. You can't have strategy by consensus. Strategy has to come from ultimately leadership. At the top has to say, this is our direction. The discussion is over. We're going to do this. And now everybody, let's rally around that. I've heard all the discussion. I've heard all the objections. Now we have to kind of rally around this. We can't try to please everybody on the management team. We can't try to make everybody feel like their department is equal. Strategy is about choices, trade-offs. It's not like that. And of course, we've got to resist that short-term pressure from shareholders. That fundamentally requires leadership. You can delegate operational improvement, but at the end of the day, you can't delegate strategy. Strategy is something that only the leader is in the position to ultimately lead. Because the leader is the only one who's responsible for all the functions of the business. And can kind of see the whole and not get too caught up in any of the parts. And leaders have a tremendously important role in strategy. Setting it, based on a lot of discussion, communicating it. There was a day, and I can remember this, so I'm getting, it's dangerous how old I'm getting here, but I can remember a day when strategy was seen as a secret. If you had a strategy, you kept it secret. You put it in the safe and didn't tell anybody. That's fundamentally the wrong idea about strategy. Strategy has to be widely communicated. Everybody better know it. All your people need to know it. Your customers need to know it. Even your competitors should know it, so that they can maybe make different choices. You need to really communicate your commitment to your strategy, and that is one helpful way of getting your competitors hopefully to decide that some other way is better for them. So strategy has to be communicated. Strategy requires enormous discipline. It's very easy to see it kind of fragment and get distracted over time with all kinds of new proposals and M&A deals and investment bankers and vendors come in, oh, I've got this wonderful machine, and there's all these pressures to essentially pull the strategy apart and remove the clarity, and the leader's job is to maintain the discipline and to figure out how the strategy needs to be updated over time. because there's constantly new technology and new ideas. The question is, how can we use them in our strategy rather than how can we copy what somebody else is doing? These are the fundamental challenges of strategy. Well, our time is very, very short, and we have a whole other session to talk about Turkey. So let me simply say that hopefully every one of you is ready now and has built their company to the point where you can now start to really inject strategic thinking. Nobody can tell you the answer. There's no one strategy that's going to work for everybody in this room. Quite the contrary. But there's a process of thinking involving you and your management team that will help show you how to shape new direction. So let's use this opportunity that Turkcell has given us and this time we're spending this morning to kind of start to make that shift in mentality and that shift in direction. So let me thank you temporarily for your attention. We're going to take a break now, and then we'll come back and talk about Turkey as a whole. Thank you.
Enter